sorry. Keep going. Did I drop something? Did I break something?
We broke something. We're going to go in a minute, guys. Hello. Hi. Good morning here in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is Lisa Jacobson. I'm president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and we're very pleased to be here in America's All-In Pavilion here at COP27. I've got an excellent panel with us today. We're going to have a robust discussion, and I love this title, The Business of Changing the Trajectory, 2030 goals as well as beyond. And I'm going to say a few words, but I'd like to just introduce our panelists first. Right to my right, we have Scott Tu, Vice President of Sustainability and the Managing Director for the Center for Energy Efficiency and Sustainability at Trane Technologies. Welcome, Scott. To his right, we have Kyle Davis, Director of U.S. Federal Policy, Regulatory, and Institutional Affairs at Enel North America. Welcome, Kyle. To his right, we have Howard Watts. Welcome, Howard, Assemblyman of Nevada's legislature. He's in the 15th District. Welcome. Right to his right, we have Anna Pavlova, who's Vice President for Strategy and Market Development at Carbon Quest. And then last but certainly not least in our lineup here, we have Bob Hinkle, who's founder and CEO and president of Metris Energy. So this topic is one where we could probably spend many hours talking about. I hope today that we can share with you from a number of different energy efficiency and energy sectors how we're viewing the challenges of both meeting short-term targets as well as kind of building the pathway to meet our longer-term targets. This involves technology, it involves public-private partnership, it involves innovation across the marketplace as well as the partnership venues. So I want to start by giving a little bit of context for the U.S. marketplace. We have had a tremendous year of progress in terms of building a policy framework to help us think both about the 2030 challenges and also the longer-term 2050 challenges. And I would say this is not just about emissions reduction. We are not only talking about mitigation here. We are talking about resilience, community resilience, and adaptation. And the good news is that many of the sectors you're going to hear from today can offer solutions to both resilience and emissions reduction challenges. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy, the organization that I'm very proud to serve as president for, is a broad-based energy trade association. We are proud also to be celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. One of the first acts of the Business Council's board in 1992 was to attend the Rio Earth Summit. That's where the Framework Convention on Climate Change was born, as well as 3 other very significant global environmental treaties. Our businesses came to that discussion in the same way that they do today, to offer technology solutions. We know we can make progress, but it really is this collaboration between industry, governments, and communities that are going to make it happen. One of the areas that the Council has focused on has been education. Education on the energy transition in the U.S. marketplace, but also worldwide. One of the tools we use to do that is a project called the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook that you can get from the Business Council's website for free. We release it each year in partnership with Bloomberg New Energy Finance. The next issue is going to come out in March of 2023. And it provides relevant, up-to-date information across many sectors that you're going to hear from today about how the energy transition is progressing and where we need to go in the future. So I encourage you to look at it. One of the data points that we're looking at, again, is policy progress. And we've made tremendous progress, as I've said. And 2 of the pieces of legislation that we might hear through this conversation that are going to transform the next phase of the energy transition is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. We want to be able to share with you some of the information about how those policies are being implemented, because we are still in the implementation phase, but they will be like no other. As long as I've been working in the field, we have not had as strong a policy underpinning as well as a catalytic investment strategy. So with that, I'm going to hop into the discussion with our panel. And we're going to start talking about finance. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as private sector innovative business models, can enable us to deploy faster and more affordably. I'd love to hear from some of the panelists about the role of finance in the energy transition, both for the short term and the longer term. Bob, I'd love to ask you to start that conversation for us on finance, the role of finance in meeting the energy transition goals. Oh, I'm sorry, I hopped into the questions. I didn't let you guys introduce yourself. So, all right, how about we do this? I'm going to take a step back. Why don't each one of you, and we can start with you, Bob, take a moment and share a little bit more about your company and your business, and then we'll get into the more, thematic conversations after. And tell us, just your reaction to the question of this panel. How are we going to meet these goals?
Sure. Well, thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the BCSC for the opportunity to be here today. So Bob Henkel, President and CEO of Metris Energy. And speaking here at this COP is particularly meaningful for me. I spent 5 years living and working in Egypt in the late 1990s, early 2000s as part of a USAID-funded energy efficiency program. 2 of my daughters were born here, so coming back to Egypt is a bit of a homecoming of sorts. And in terms of Metris Energy, we are a developer, financer, and an owner of larger scale energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, primarily for larger commercial and industrial firms, but also for schools and hospitals as well. We finance and implement projects through our Energy as a Service solution, whereby we fund 100% of the project cost, own the assets, and then have customers pay us back based on the measured or realized energy savings or renewable energy that's generated. And in terms of the question of the day, are we on the right trajectory for hitting 2030 goals? Not a surprise, I'd say. On the ground reality is that we're pretty far off track. And I look to a couple data points, recent data points, to illustrate that. One is a United Nations Environment Programs report that shows that countries projecting 2030 emissions are less than, or have 1% reduction that they're projecting. You compare that to last year at COP27 and the 45% that was pledged, we're pretty far off. Same on the business front, where about 2,000 of the world's largest businesses, a third of them have made net zero targets, but you look at where they are in the progress on that, and over 90% of them are behind pace. So a lot of work to do, and I think where some of that work can be done, it's not through a lack of opportunity, is on energy efficiency. And part of, I guess, the discussion today really will center on getting work done within the built environment, where it's a lot easier to make commitments than to implement projects, just given that projects need to be implemented where people are living and working. There's other competing business needs. So there's a lot of planning that needs to happen, and that's where I think a shift needs to occur to get us on the right path. So.
Thank you, Bob. Let's go to Anna next, please. Introduce yourself and respond to our question of the day, please.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. So sticking to the buildings theme, our company, Carbon Quest, helps buildings reduce their emissions by capturing CO2 from the buildings. We started in New York City, a big metropolis, with 17 million tons of CO2 emitted every year from just natural gas combustion. And that is primarily from buildings, not from transportation. And we then sell the CO2 to concrete manufacturers who repurpose the CO2 and mineralize it into rock. And that goes back into city buildings. And we also are looking at other pathways, all of them with emissions reductions benefit in the end for the city and the economy. And one interesting statistic I heard yesterday actually from PwC, they were talking about the building sector globally and saying that in order to get on track with IPCC, the building sector needed to have reduced 15% of emissions last year. We got to 0.5. So we have a real problem in the building sector because it's decarbonizing very, very slowly.
Howard, welcome.
Thank you so much. I am here as part of a delegation from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, which works with state lawmakers in all 50 states, regardless of party affiliation, to advance conservation and environmental issues. First of all, I think there are so many different roles that the public sector can play when it comes to helping meet the goals that we have. In the state of Nevada, we have set our own goals related to the IPCC in order to try and pull our own weight and do our fair share to meet these goals. And like my fellow panelists, we're doing yearly analysis, and we are not on track to hit our 2030 goals right now. There's a lot of excitement about some of the federal policy that has been enacted, and the way that a lot of that is going to be implemented is at the state and local level. I think government is a great partner for helping with spurring research and with providing policy that can help some of these initiatives move forward, while also bringing economic development benefits to our communities as well. And I think the last thing I'd say, just as an initial thought, is that state and local governments have really been on the forefront on a lot of these policy initiatives, and have helped, I think, create an environment and momentum that's led to some of the major federal investments and policies that we're now seeing. States and local governments have really been on the leading edge when it comes to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kyle.
Well, good morning, everybody. Kyle Davis with Enel. For those of you that might not be familiar, Enel overseas is the largest private owner of electric utilities in the world. So they own utilities in Europe and in South America. But in the United States, they really only have two types of businesses. One is large-scale renewable project development, and the other is behind-the-meter projects for commercial industrial customers. That could be everything from microgrids to standalone energy storage to electric vehicle charging. We do quite a bit of that as well. So we kind of are really excited about what has happened in the U.S. as far as the different policy initiatives. I work out of the Washington, D.C. office, so feel very personal about what we're able to get done through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's some provisions in there that we've been working on for over 10 years and finally got across the finish line. And then obviously in the Inflation Reduction Act, and the 10 years of regulatory predictability is going to be absolutely critical for the renewables industry that we work in as well. So happy to be here today, and hopefully can give you a sense of, from a developer's perspective, just what kind of days we have ahead of us, as long as we can preserve the two pieces of legislation.
Scott, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Scott, too. It's great to be here with you, and thanks to the Business Council, and congratulations on 30 years, Lisa. It's quite remarkable, and also for your leadership at events like COP. We're proud partners. I work for Trane Technologies. Trane is the leading heating, ventilation, and air conditioning company worldwide. We heat and cool many of the world's offices and commercial spaces, as well as in North America, many homes. We also own the world's largest transport refrigeration company, Thermo King, and every day we're transporting 62% of the world's fresh food in 141 countries. So we live and breathe cooling. Today, though, my focus in this discussion is more about the built environment. Anna mentioned a few minutes ago some issues with the built environment. It represents roughly 39% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. We've not done enough yet to reduce emissions in that space. But here's the good news. The good news is we have done a lot in transportation via electrification. We've done a lot on the energy side, the supply side of energy. The last big opportunity, in my view, is the built environment. And the opportunities are immense. And here's the second piece of good news. 5 years ago, if we were sitting with a building owner and we used the words decarbonization or sustainability or emissions reductions, the building owner would have asked us to leave the building. We would have never made the sale. Today, very different. Alignment is happening. Despite the small amount of progress so far in the built environment emission space, that space has also been growing its emissions footprint. So we actually, for once, have kept things at a flat line, and now we're poised to truly bend the curve. And I'll talk about how we're doing that later in our discussion.
Thank you all for introducing yourself and sharing some preliminary points. Now I'm going to get to the question I posed before. I would love to talk a little bit about the role of finance. And I'd love to start with you, Bob. So thank you for rolling with it here.
Excellent. Yeah, well, so in terms of getting to any of the 2030 goals or really anything in the 2050 net zero range, financing is going to have to be a key part of it. And it makes sense because any type of building efficiency upgrade, on-site renewable energy project requires a significant amount of upfront capital. So to get to those decarbonization goals within the built environment, capital is going to be critical, and a lot of it is going to have to come from the private sector. The International Energy Agency is estimating that by 2030, private investment will need to account for 70% of $4 trillion of investment in sustainable energy. So a significant part's going to be coming from third-party private financiers. And you look to innovative types of financing, energy as a service, but other third-party project finance ownership structures, and that can help be a significant part of the capital inflows that are needed. Energy as a service specifically can help and really has two main attributes that can be impactful. First is that energy as a service can help unlock energy savings potential within the built environment, whereby you have an energy as a service provider funding 100% of the upfront cost of a project and then structuring the repayments that come back from building owners and commercial entities so that they're paying from the energy savings that are generated. So it's something that can be cash flow positive. Secondly, it can help expand the wish list of upgrades that building owners want to accomplish. And that can be done by strategically bundling together different types of upgrades together. That can be different types of energy efficiency and renewable upgrades together. It can be standalone types of energy efficiency upgrades where you take lower cost, shorter payback energy efficiency upgrades, bundle them together with higher cost, longer payback projects to get to greater impact. So you put that together and the net result is greater net savings in terms of energy, but also more accelerated reduction and a greater scale of GHG emission savings. So I think it's a key area to help us get back on that right track to 2030.
Thank you very much, Bob. Howard, I'd love to hear from you a little bit on financing and how you're seeing it from Nevada's standpoint.
Yeah, well, both from Nevada's specific standpoint, but also from a state level standpoint. A few years ago, we created a green bank, and we have just recently funded it, brought on staff, and one of the main things that we're trying to do is help leverage private capital and help identify financing gaps that we can strategically fill in order to help make projects happen, either areas where financing isn't currently available or where we can provide an extra bit of financing to help make projects possible. So there's also, I think, a broader way that governments can assist with financing in terms of looking at creative options like enabling property assessed financing for states that regulate their utilities, looking at on-bill financing and other things. So there are a lot of different creative avenues that states can take to help address financing issues, but it really has to be a partnership with the private sector and helping to identify and then use some of these other creative tools to fill the gaps. And so The Inflation Reduction Act has money to help support green banks, so that's something that that our state is extremely interested in. And we've also enabled property-assessed clean energy financing, which is starting to get off the ground in our state as well.
Sharing that. Sure, Kyle, hop in.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on some of the attributes of the Inflation Reduction Act that really change some of the project financing options. So historically, for large-scale renewable projects, we've had access to the tax equity market as a way to monetize the tax credits. The main thing I want to point out in the Inflation Reduction Act are two significant changes because the sheer amount of investments that's going to be necessary or triggered by the act would seemingly swamp the tax equity market. And there were two new policy changes included in there. One is a direct pay alternative. So if you're a nonprofit, if we work with like a municipal utility, a rural co-op, a tribe, they're able to take a direct pay alternative to the tax credit, meaning they'll get a cash refund check from the U.S. Treasury Department instead of having to go and take the tax credit and find somebody that could use the tax credit. That's a brand new circumstance. That is something we think will really energize the project development amongst the nonprofit part of the electricity sector in the United States. The other concept that was introduced in there is something that the United States did several decades ago, and it's come back, and that's transferability. So we also have an opportunity, if we're a private industry and we don't necessarily have a tax appetite, we can work with other taxpayers that do have an appetite and look to try and transfer the value for some sort of premium with that third-party taxpayer so they could take credit for it. So historically, like I said, we've had just the tax equity market. Now we have the tax equity market, we have direct pay alternative, and now we have transferability. So it is a remarkable change. We're waiting for the IRS to issue guidance on those latter two new provisions. So no final word on those yet, but we think that that's something that will dramatically change the financing of a lot of these clean energy technologies in the U.S. market over the next 10 years.
Thank you, Kyle. Bob, did you want to hop in? I saw you maybe wanted to make a comment after Howard. Yeah.
Yeah, just a point that working with the state green banks is important. Within the IRA, it does a lot of great things. One of the things that it does not do in the commercial and industrial sectors have a lot related to energy efficiency. And one of the areas where energy efficiency can benefit is from some of the Department of Energy longer-term loan programs. And for energy efficiency to be eligible, it has to have a nexus with the green bank. So, something we'll look to leverage.
Thank you. Very helpful, all of you. Next, I'd like to shift to technology, and I know that pretty much everybody has something to say on the panel about the current state of technology innovation. Scott, may I start with you, please? I'd love to hear your thoughts from Train Technologies' perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Technology is playing a bigger role than ever in this transition or trajectory of 2030. And it's taking several forms. One is, as I mentioned earlier, this entire view of decarbonization cannot happen without a view of systems efficiency or a systems level approach to reducing emissions. So we've moved beyond just talking about efficient components to how we approach building in its very holistically, which brings in all of the elements and ways that we can adjust the efficiency of a building to reduce emissions. In the past, it was always about the component efficiency. Now it's also important about component efficiency, but now it's a lot more about connected environments, the use of sensors, the use of artificial intelligence, taking the data that comes from a building and allowing that data to help to inform how the building is managed can be a significant contribution to efficiency. And then I have to mention technologies that we would call the latest clean technologies, such as combined heating and cooling systems for commercial applications. Some would call them thermal management systems or heat pumps. These systems that combine heating and cooling can truly take the fossil fuels out of a building. No more fossil fuels are needed for heating, and 90% of thermal processes in buildings are using fossil fuels currently. So it's a tremendous opportunity. The technologies exist today. We're installing them in buildings, hospitals, office complexes, campuses around the world. These are highly effective. The performance of the systems is much more energy efficient, sometimes 300% more than the technology that it replaces. So it's a massive time to think of the building holistically and using the technologies that we have in place to lead to exponential gains.
That is a tremendous opportunity in terms of efficiency gains. So, Anna, I'd like to go to you next because you also work in the building sector, and not everybody thinks of carbon capture when they think of buildings. Can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So as I said before, clearly the building sector is behind in reducing emissions. There's been a lot done in efficiency, but I think we have a lot more to go there as well. But when we think about immediate solutions, that 90% that is using gas right now in buildings, it's hard for them to electrify right off the bat. And so if we don't want to wait for some of these buildings, we got to do something else. And carbon capture can be that tool to do something while we're kind of getting to the greener grid that enables electrification properly. One of the examples would be, so we started in New York City, and we have clients who come to us, for example, a major educational institution that did an electrification study, and it's $500 million. That is very difficult for an educational facility to spend that much money, where 7 times less than that, even with the largest possible system. So I think that some buildings absolutely can go to electrification right away. Some will do it later. Some will, for example, those that run on combined heat and power, that may take a really, really long time. And so we see that as an immediate method to reduce emissions, and buildings typically have a huge range of emissions. That's another thing that I get a lot of questions. Can they really, how much are we talking about per building? Well, an average kind of bigger building is between, just think of New York City or Chicago or even Denver, emits between 2,500 tons a year to as much as 80,000 a year. At that point, we're talking about a mini industrial facility, really. So that's a huge range. We can address all of it, and that's how we get to 37 or 39% total emissions, is because buildings actually do generate a lot of emissions.
Thank you, Anna. Kyle, I'd love to hear from your perspective. You mentioned several technology areas that Enel North America is involved in. How do you see the technology landscape?
Is there a chance to pull up one of the slides? So, one more back. No, that's emissions. I'll go for it. All right, so I'll go ahead and use this one. This is the repeat project that's done out of Princeton University, and basically what they're showing here is the annual capital investment that's going to be triggered by the Inflation Reduction Act. And the point that I want to make is that I don't think anybody really has absorbed really the cumulative effect of what this legislation is going to mean to the electricity sector in particular. What you see on the left is going to be what the current policy investments were likely to be, and then as a result of passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the new investments are going to be on the right. What is remarkable is that the legislation could drive roughly about $4.1 trillion of investment in the U.S. economy just for the energy sector and the decarbonization. What you're looking at in this slide, I'll just briefly touch on some of the key technologies that are going to benefit from it. For those of you that might be big fans of carbon capture and sequestration, it's looking to roughly allocate about $28 billion to prove that technology out once and for all. Will it work or will it not work? We should know within the next 10 years. You're looking at an annual investment in hydrogen production, both using electrolysis as well as methane reforming, up to $4 billion annually by 2030. I can tell you green hydrogen production is something that a renewables developer like Enel is very interested in having as an additional product from our wind and solar projects. And the U.S. nuclear industry is very excited about the opportunity to produce green hydrogen on the hours where they're not able to curtail output from those baseload nuclear power plants. So during their off-peak hours, they now have a new product that they could potentially produce and sell into the marketplace. And why is that important? Because hydrogen is viewed to be absolutely critical for the hard to decarbonize or hard to electrify parts of the U.S. economy. So that's going to be truly transformative. And you can't use traditional hydrogen today because it has its own decarbonization challenges. So between renewables and nuclear, you're going to see some really clean hydrogen coming into the United States. Perhaps the biggest investment that the Act will make will be on the wind and solar project development, which is our bread and butter in the United States. You're looking at going from a current policy of $181 billion per year to an almost doubling of roughly about $334 billion by 2030. That is transformative. And then we also have to acknowledge that, of course, what's going to be absolutely critical to that build-out is going to be new transmission investment. And so this particular bill anticipates doubling the amount of investment on an annual basis in transmission in order to bring those new clean energy technologies to the grid. And you're looking at increases up to about $46 billion. So we look at this bill, and like I said, we don't think anybody has fully absorbed the cumulative impact of this legislation and what it's going to mean over the next 10 years. And it all plays in each one of these buckets. We do the large-scale renewables, we do the small-scale. These projections here don't even include the electrification that we're going to see in the transportation sector. So we're extremely excited. We think that this long-term policy is really a U.S. industrial policy married with decarbonization. And that's something that we haven't seen in a very long time. And we do believe it's going to be transformative and then have a ripple effect out into the global marketplace as well. So supply chain problems probably in the first few years. Once those start to get resolved, once some of the new reshoring of domestic manufacturing, these clean energy technologies occur, we think the race is going to be on, and it'll be remarkable when we look back in 2030 just how much changed in that short 10-year time frame.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Let me, before we leave technology, see if anybody wants to make a comment if they haven't already on technology. Good. Well, I mean, that's a very good shift in the next part of our conversation, which is on policy. And one of the things that the council was so pleased about with both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act was the broad-based portfolio approach it took from a technology perspective. Our core industries, supply side and demand side energy efficiency, natural gas, the broad portfolio of renewables, all have an opportunity to evolve, transform, decarbonize. And what I hear around our leadership tables is this aha moment, what can we do more of? Things that were not possible before might be possible in the future, and they're ready to get working. But as we all know, the federal policy is extremely important, and the long-term nature of it is really historic, especially in the areas of the tax credit. But a lot of our decisions on energy come at the state and local level. So I want to talk about that a little bit, both policies at large, but in particular state and local policy. So Howard, can you start us a little bit on that? Why is it important from a U.S. perspective that state and local governments be aligned and work with the private sector and also help shape and inform and implement federal policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I think I want to go back to an earlier point, which is that state and local governments have often been on the leading edge of moving some of these policies forward to help provide certainty of interest and also to help shape demand that helps get some of these new technologies to the market. I've worked in Nevada on things like energy efficiency standards, building codes at the local level. All of these are things when we're talking about changing the built environment. Those are concrete policies that are helping transform demand and helping create the certainty that allows businesses that are developing those innovative technologies to bring them to market. Also at the state level, we've been working a lot in Nevada on decarbonizing transportation, and I've talked with companies that as we're seeing this dramatic increase in the development and deployment of electric vehicles, they are prioritizing delivery of those vehicles, whether it's for corporate fleets or for sale to customers, to the locations that have developed aggressive policies. So those are all ways that states can help take the lead with policy and help support the deployment of new and innovative technology. The other thing that I would say is in Nevada, it's a major economic development issue for us. Our economy is extremely tourism and hospitality based, but we have tremendous opportunities, solar potential, geothermal potential, lithium deposits. So we have the opportunity to address some of our challenges, which in Nevada also include limited water supply, but do that in a way that's also making us a hub for innovation and diversifying our economy. And so we've built that into some of our economic development initiatives. We've also just recently, our 2 public universities have become R1 research institutions, and I think that's another role that we can play from the public side is helping on that, provide the research and R&D support that helps drive innovation and then helps support the development of new technologies from the private sector.
And we alluded to this before, but much of the funding, other than the tax credits in the areas of greenhouse gas reduction and resilience, are going to go to the states. And so states like Nevada will sometimes work in partnership with other states, maybe in the hydrogen space or in electric or sustainable transportation. But in other areas, they're going to be coming up with plans and applying or receiving these resources to implement their plans. Anything you want to talk about what the next year might look like in terms of implementation processes?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's similar to some of the other panelists. We're waiting for guidance on a lot of these things as well. And so as guidance is coming out, as dollars are rolling out, as competitive grant applications are coming out, we're going to be constantly studying and pursuing those. I think, the earlier that we can get as many stakeholders involved in bringing innovative ideas to the table, the better, because like you said, a lot of that funding is the way that it actually gets deployed is going to be through state and local governments. Some of it is set, and we develop a plan of how we're going to allocate those dollars. Some of it's competitive, and I honestly, I think all of those things are good. And again, it goes back to one of the questions you brought up was around kind of uniformity. I know that there's definitely benefits to that, but I think when we're talking from this perspective of how do we hit these goals, we have to really be aggressive and bold and drive innovation forward. And I think competition in some of those processes and competition between state and local governments, when someone says, well, hey, over here they're doing this really bold and innovative thing, and that's going to attract businesses over there. That's what I want to do in Nevada when it comes to businesses working on clean technology, water conservation, etc. And so I actually think that having some of that push and pull of implementation at the state and local level is going to ultimately help drive us to help catch up and hopefully hit these targets faster.
Thank you, Howard. Anna, you work also at especially the city level. Anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, so we see a lot of jurisdictions, cities, states moving to carbon intensity reduction goals, right? In the past, we focused on energy intensity reduction. Now we're talking about carbon And it's that's great. I think that, so for example, cities like New York and Boston go as far as penalizing their buildings for exceeding a certain amount of emissions per year. In New York, it's a very aggressive target, $268 a ton of CO2 as a penalty. In Boston, it's $234. So, but I think that the next trick becomes, well, you don't want buildings to just pay the penalty. That doesn't really do anything for the climate. So how do you make sure that policy allows decarbonization, moves it fast enough, and doesn't leave people feeling like they don't know how to do this? And one of the things that we're observing is that, cities are not quite, the more we're getting to 2.5 degrees in climate change, the harder the more complex these solutions become. These solutions are getting more and more interconnected with each other, right? When we capture, we have to think about, what do we do with it? Oh, we got to put it in concrete. Well, the city of New York has to think about both of those things together now, and that goes for, hydrogen economy will have the same thing, where the systems are getting really complex and really interconnected. And are policymakers prepared to understand that level of detail and nuance and make sure that they truly drive innovation, as opposed to say, hey, we've heard about this one solution, let's just all go there. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge. We're going to have to really drive education with policymakers in a way that we really haven't done to date on some very complex issues.
Thank you, Anna. Bob, do you have some thoughts on policy?
Yeah, maybe taking it, I guess, back to the federal level. One of the things that I'm excited about is the proposed SEC climate rule, where I think the required disclosure, mandatory and standardization of disclosure on GHG emissions can be very impactful. And that'll happen in a couple different ways. First off, just having disclosure of emissions in 10K reports using the internationally accepted greenhouse gas protocol is impactful. Having companies report on their scope 1 and 2 direct emissions, and then potentially indirect emissions for scope 3, all of that is going to be very material and start to drive action. Secondly, and maybe one of the, I think, kind of quietly revolutionary aspects of the SEC proposal is that any company that goes out there and makes a commitment publicly on GHG emissions or any type of climate-related target is, after they make that commitment publicly, they have to report on their progress to that target annually. And it's deeper than even just reporting on progress. It's looking at how they're getting the emission reductions moving. So that'll show whether companies are making progress by purchasing offsets or renewable energy that's generated sometimes hundreds of miles away from where their actual business operations are, or whether they're looking to abate within their own built environment. And then just the last item is the gravitational pull. If you look at the market capitalization of all the companies that are reporting under the SEC, I think it's going to have a normative de facto effect where other companies outside of that jurisdiction are going to begin to think about reporting on their emissions. Companies that also report to the SEC but have suppliers, their suppliers will start to think about their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that type of knock-on effect could quietly start to accumulate a pretty big impact.
Thank you, Bob. And as you know, I'm very proud that we co-authored a blog on that topic and had some good pickup in the publications on it too. So Utility Dive, I believe, right? So thank you for your leadership and thought leadership on the BCSC with that topic. And yeah, the BCSC also is very eager to see what will happen as those rules move into the next phase of the process, which could be a final rule by the end of the year or into early next year. So thank you. So I know I'd love to hear from you, Scott, and Kyle about this question of policy. So, Scott.
Yeah, I agree with Bob's point about the SEC rule. Train Technologies is supportive of the rule. We had our own individual comments as a company and supported other organizations. And it's for the reason that Bob highlighted, which is we believe that transparency and disclosure of emissions data is a precursor to better behavior. And it just changes the conversation. We also believe that there's a role for policy. The Assemblyman mentioned what Nevada's doing. One of the things that we're talking to state leaders about and national leaders is a move away from simply looking at efficiency of components to this performance. How's the building performing? Whether we're talking indoor environmental quality, whether we're talking efficiency of the building, whether we're talking about the waste. We're also moving away from those design criteria like LEED and others which were about the design of the building, because that doesn't really give the building owner a good picture of how the building will perform. So moving towards performance standards is a positive thing that I think it's directly related to Bob's points about emissions and disclosure and emissions. And that's really where we need to move. I think these things are locked, and they're locked in a very good way. And I mean, that's going to help the trajectory. It also, I think that also is going to make sure that that the 2030 commitments are more meaningful and actually more impactful. We see the funding. The funding is just accelerating the adoption of technologies. So the funding plays a huge role. That's from the policy side. But the same thing about the SEC's rule and performance-based standards. All these three things, it's going to accelerate tremendously, just like you saw in the graph a few minutes ago. We see a tremendous acceleration and opportunity to 2030.
Thank you. Kyle.
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize something that Howard had made mention of, and that is the state and local governments. And I wanted to give a little bit of love to the infrastructure bill and call out some specific programs that we're excited about. One of which is the establishment of a nationwide electric vehicle charging network that was funded through that infrastructure bill. It is something that the grant dollars are formula grants that will go to each of the states. And I'm happy to say all 50 states developed plans on how they would develop a public infrastructure charging network across their jurisdictions that link up to the other states. So that's something that we're looking forward to the states beginning the process of allocating the funding to the developers that will build and construct those public charging stations according to the plans that each of the states adopted. That's a wonderful example of where the states are going to be in the lead because they will be judging and awarding those funding proposals. And then the other two areas are an exciting area for us, and that's going to be transit bus and school bus electrification. Similarly, there are formula grants that are going directly to transit agencies under the infrastructure bill to electrify transit operations, and the Biden administration has sort of a default presumption now that every transit bus is going to be electric on a going forward basis, is requiring transit districts to develop those electrification strategies. And then the exciting program around school buses, for a number of different reasons, is being administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, and that's billions of dollars over the next 5 years to help them electrify school buses. And I'm happy to say that the very first round of awards for about $1 billion was made a little over a week ago, and you have 385 new school districts that are going to be getting their very first electric school bus and learning how to take that technology and incorporate it into into their systems, into their fleet operations. And that's another example of local government really taking the leadership in the electrification of transportation side of this effort. So some really exciting stuff being led by state and local governments. And again, these are programs that were called out and created or augmented with additional funding on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So these are separate from what you're going to see coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thank you, everyone. Great conversation so far. In our final round together, taking a step back, we have very aggressive goals, as we know, for both the short term and the long term. If there were one or two things that you could tell policymakers at home or in these halls, international policymakers, what would it take to bend the curve and to get the types of emissions reductions we're going to need for both the short term and the longer term? On this one, Who wants to start first? Let's see. All
I'll
right,
go ahead and
Kyle,
go
you got
first
the
since I-
microphone.
Yeah, I've got the microphone. So from a large-scale renewable developer's perspective, it's transmission, and interconnection queue. And what I mean by interconnection queue, it's the amount of time it takes once you have a viable project to actually get it interconnected into the grid so you can start delivering electricity to the grid. Right now, you're looking at interconnection queues, depending on the U.S. electricity market, that could be anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And the amount of time that it takes to interconnect a project just continues to grow. So it's something that we're hopeful that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can make some progress on, help speed up those interconnection turnaround times so we can actually deliver those clean electrons to customers sooner rather than later. And then the transmission build out. Our transmission system was designed for a very different type of market. We've got some tremendous renewables potential in very remote areas, but we need to be able to get those low-cost renewables to load in those big urban communities. We've got a wonderful opportunity where most of the transmission system is aging out over the next 10 years, and it would be a huge mistake for us to just replace like for like, and instead we need to be more thoughtful, we need to be more strategic, and we need to figure out how we can leverage those existing plans to replace existing infrastructure with, that's currently 1940s and 50s vintage with not only state-of-the-art technology, but to areas where we can really take advantage and maximize this country's renewables production. So, like I said, if I could just ask for two things, it's interconnection queue reform, get projects connected to the grid faster, and a more strategic, thoughtful build-out of transmission on a going-forward basis.
Thanks, Kyle. Yes, Scott, I was going to suggest you go next.
Yeah, it's good that we're fixing the transmission and the renewables in place, because the thing that I would say is, can we decarbonize the built environment? The answer is yes. However, we cannot decarbonize the built environment without addressing heat. We must electrify buildings, and we must take fossil fuels out of buildings, and to do that, we have to electrify the buildings and install the technologies and systems that provide the heating and cooling, many times in combined heating and cooling systems, that fully decarbonize the built environment. So what policymakers need to do, and this is what we're finding over and over, is there's a myth about, does the technology exist? Does it work in all climates? Does it work in all environments? Can it work in all building types? And the answer to that is yes, yes, and yes. We can do it today. No need to wait on technologies in the future. And it works wherever you are. And so these are the things that we need to be helping them understand.
Howard, next. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'd add to this conversation that has kind of been alluded to but hasn't been discussed yet is the importance of equity. And, when we talk about the federal pieces of legislation, there are specific pools of funding that are dedicated specifically to lower income communities, to communities of color, to areas that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. And that's important, as well as the administration's current Justice 40 commitment of delivering at least 40% of the benefits of these programs writ large to those communities. Historically, a lot of these things, as we're talking about bringing innovative technologies, they are seen as luxuries, and these communities are often the last to see those benefits, economic benefits, health, safety, comfort benefits, economic benefits, not only of the savings but also of potential jobs being brought into communities. And so I'm really excited that we've got some more dedication, and that's what it takes. I guess that's my call, is for other policymakers to partner with folks in the private sector and make sure that we're not just setting a goal. We've been talking throughout this panel about goals. They're important, but we need to follow that up with extremely concrete, dedicated action. And I think if we continue to build on that, not only are we going to hit these carbon reduction goals that we've set and that we're talking about, but for one of the first times in a major era of kind of technological transformation, we can actually bring every community along at once. And I think that's incredibly exciting and impactful.
I would put a slight twist to what Scott just said to say that there is no perfect technology, and it's not one technology is ever going to work for everything, and that's okay. I think for policymakers, the most important thing is to stay flexible, set aggressive goals, and then let the market figure out how to get there. Let the innovators figure out how to meet those goals. And that will change. Technology will change over time. There will be applications that work now that won't work 20 years from now, and that's fine too. As soon as we don't chase one thing, but we set the point of this is to reduce emissions. Our whole conference is about reducing emissions, not just one solution. So let's all go do that.
Well, I think I'll close it out and say energy efficiency. It's right there in front of us. If you look at Alliance to Save Energy did an assessment seeing what it would take for the U.S. to meet its Paris Agreement commitments in terms of GHG reduction. Energy efficiency alone can count for over 50% of that. So it's right there in front of us. It's in the buildings. We've talked about the importance of the built environment. In terms of policies, doing more of what New York City and Boston are doing. I love the energy efficiency ratings on buildings in New York. So anyway, that's exciting to see.
Thank you all for that. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is going to be a lightning round. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll give you one more opportunity to talk about anyone who wants to talk a little bit about resilience and how we've talked a lot about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but is there an opportunity to do both? I mean, are we able to accomplish both with the technologies and the policies that we've been discussing? So I don't know who wants to dive in first on that.
All right, well, I'm holding the microphone, so I'll just say, obviously resilience is key everywhere in rural communities and urban communities in all parts of the world. Some of our most resilient systems that can separate themselves from the grid in case of emergencies or when the grid goes down during a natural disaster, those systems can be incredibly efficient. I'm thinking of cogeneration, combined heat and power, but can also have higher emissions and can be the hardest to decarbonize, and also have very long life cycles and don't have that many options, because typically if a hospital really needs to be able to separate from the grid, it's going to need that forever. And so how do we do both resilience and decarbonization is something that we're working on very actively. We have a lot of clients coming to us specifically with that problem. How do I keep my resilience and reduce emissions in my combined heat and power system? That goes for industrial, not just buildings. That's across the board, critical infrastructure facilities. So we're trying to tackle that challenge, and I think others do too. But that's something we have to keep in mind. We have to be sensitive to resilience when we talk about reducing emissions.
So, as a state lawmaker, I get to think about it resilience really broadly, not just in the grid resilience sector. And in Nevada, two other factors that I really think about, or actually three: extreme heat, air quality, and water. All of which have various climate connections. In Reno, I live in Las Vegas, but in Reno, they have had periods for weeks where air quality is terrible, extremely unsafe, and yet it's a community that historically hasn't needed to have air conditioning units. And so, looping this back around to technology, we have an opportunity to replace, fossil fuel heating systems with heat pumps that can also provide cooling and provide air filtration when we inevitably see those wildfire impacts. So there's a great example of resilience that we can help support. Water and energy, huge nexus there. Water treatment and delivery, major consumption of power, and especially fossil fuel generation has been historically a huge user of water. So there's a lot of opportunities to help, and opportunities for policy to help build resilience in those different areas, and I'm excited for it.
Thank you, Howard. I want to thank our panelists. This has really been a tremendous conversation. I want to thank America's All In Pavilion for allowing us to be here today. If you're interested in learning more about the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, please go to our website. We have a dedicated COP27 webpage where you could learn more about all of our speakers and about our activities here. And I'd also like to commend our Director of International Programs, Laura Tierney, who's put this program together as well as many others. So kudos to her, and I really appreciate all the hard work we're all doing. And we got 1 week to go, so we'll keep it going strong. Thanks, everybody.